Hey, it's Emma Chamberlain. I designed these new glasses for Warby Parker, and I basically can't take them off. Like, I'm showering in them and sleeping in them. They're just that good. Go see them all at warbyparker.com. And you know what? Have a good day too. Okay? All right? Bye.
Ryan Reynolds here for Mint Mobile. One of the perks about having 4 kids that you know about is actually getting a direct line to the big man up north. And this year, he wants you to know the best gift that you can give someone is the gift of Mint Mobile's unlimited wireless for $15 a month. Now, you don't even need to wrap it. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
In the last lecture of our short series on women's history in America, a lecture on women's rights and sports history. In this discussion from March of 2014 at Georgetown University, Professor Bonnie Morris explores the history of discrimination against women in sports and the impact of Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. Title IX changed the landscape by prohibiting discrimination based on sex in any federally funded education program or activity. Professor Morris highlights how this landmark legislation opened doors for women in sports, reshaping both athletic opportunities and the culture of competition in America. More after this.
As the year ends, we need your help to keep democracy accessible to everyone. 100% of your tax-deductible gift supports C-SPAN's work, giving you unfiltered access to your government. For decades, C-SPAN has brought you straightforward, unbiased coverage, free from ads and partisan spin. But we can't do it without you. Visit cspan.org/donate to make your gift today. Give now to protect democracy unfiltered in 2025 and beyond. Thank you for your support. And don't forget, visit cspan.org/donate to help keep this mission going.
So hi there. Welcome to Athletics and Gender again. And today's topic is Title IX. And this is a huge subject. It's of great interest to everybody. It's of interest to athletes, educators, policymakers, your parents, your children. And it's such an enormous subject, it could go for a year-long course. But just a little mini lesson today to get us started will be a good beginning. And the more you know about Title IX, the better your applications to law school will look, because it really is one of the biggest changes in women's lives, and it's altered the very school setting we find ourselves in now. So Title IX is a law that's part of the Education Acts of 1972. And it appears at a point when there had already been more than 15 years of civil rights legislation, and much of the country had been focused on civil rights specifically pertaining to race for quite a bit of time. Unfortunately, there was very slow progress in changing women's opportunities, even though there was so much public discussion about equality, discrimination, injustice. Gender was a category that didn't get a lot of investigation until later in the 60s and 70s. And the state of the US in 1972 was very tough for a woman who wanted to be an athlete or a scholar. For one thing, many schools simply didn't admit women at all. They had no admission for women, or they only admitted them on a quota basis, and that included the best universities in the country. So many of the Ivy League schools either barred women altogether, or you were only admitted, let's say, Harvard, Yale, they had a system, maybe every 2 women who were admitted, 3 men had to be admitted. So there was a constant ratio where there were more men, and women were held to a much higher standard. Elsewhere, if women got into schools, they were held to very different academic requirements. You couldn't major in what you wanted. You could be barred, let's say, from the engineering school. Most women found it difficult to get accepted into an architecture program. Women were steered toward a very specific number of traditional majors and minors. And on top of that, this trickled down to high school, middle school, elementary school. Girls had to take home ec with the assumption they were going to become homemakers, and guys had to take shop, even if they didn't want to. if you'll remember from the movie The Breakfast Club. So there was a lot of no choice, and a lot of this had to do with the amount of money you might earn later on. If you were in, let's say, a vocational high school, as a female, you would be trained to be a secretary or a beautician. These are noble professions, but you wouldn't be looking at nearly as high wages as if you were a guy in a vocational program where you'd be learning how to be a plumber or an electrician. So what starts to happen is a kind of groundswell of girls and women complaining about the lack of choices they have in school. They can't do this, they're required to do that. They're barred from this kind of school, even if they're the best in their field. They can't go to a magnet school if they're talented. Bronx Science, good example. Math and Science Magnet School, boys only. So everywhere we looked, it was perfectly legal for schools to discriminate against women and girls. There wasn't any law that said you can't. And this also affected, surprisingly, a lot of the conditions for women who aspired to be doctors, lawyers, et cetera. It was perfectly legal if you went to a grad school interview to be asked, why should we give you a place? Aren't you just going to get married and get pregnant? Shouldn't we save a spot in law school or med school for a man? After all, he's going to be the breadwinner. How should we invest in you? You're a risk. Look at you, you're attractive. You're probably going to meet a man, get married, and leave the program, and that's a waste for us. You should know now it's illegal to be asked these things if you're interviewing for med school and law school. But it was almost impossible for women to go through the normal stages of applying, no matter how high their grades were. All of this was perfectly legitimate. It was also very uncomfortable for women in Congress. They could be here serving the country, but barred from using the gym or the pool in Congress, which were men only. So in government as well, we had discrimination based on space and an expectation you just wouldn't find women in certain places. And eventually, a number of women got together and began to push for a clear set of laws that would say it was unfair and anti-American to discriminate against women and girls in an education setting, while other things were lagging behind, trying to get equal wages and many of the other changes. We start to get a group of activists, scholars, and Congress people trying to get a piece of legislation that would clearly cover what schools had to do to treat all students equally. So this is the situation in 1972, and I put some statistics on the board. The percentage of men who were in school was much higher than the percentage of women, and the percentage of male athletes was vastly higher than female athletes. 99% of most schools' budgets went to male athletes, leaving 1% for women. And what we find is that participation in sports would turn out to be one of the most controversial aspects of Title IX. So Title IX is pushed through Congress and it's signed into law by Richard Nixon on June 23, 1972. And the law is very much supported by Birch Bayh, who's from Indiana, representing Indiana, which is very significant because, once again, it's the Midwest that had a tradition of supporting women's sports. Initially, the law doesn't say anything about athletics. It basically says, as you have in front of you, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So, as my father would say, there's a lot of wiggle room there. Basically says a school getting federal money may not discriminate. That means if you're a school that doesn't accept federal financial assistance, you can still discriminate, and a lot did. A number of religious schools elected not to accept federal money so that they could have very specific kinds of statutes. A good example would be Bob Jones University, had a very controversial law banning interracial dating. In order to maintain that law, Bob Jones rejected federal funding. Most schools, however, take some kind of financial funding. And examples of that would be a Pell Grant, student loans, providing free lunches for students, having a sign language interpreter in a classroom who's provided for a student with a hearing impairment, all of the things that we just take for granted. And more recently, with the Americans with Disabilities Act, building a ramp, making sure a school is accessible, that's all underwritten by the US government. So if you're a school that has those things, you have to be in compliance with Title IX. So in 1972, when the law is passed, the situation is pretty dire. There's not very many activities that do encourage girls. There's lots of rationalization of why women should be excluded. So it's going to take all of the 70s to educate schools about what this new law means. What does it mean that you cannot exclude a student from an activity based on sex? What does that mean? And right away, what seems very obvious to a lot of educators is this is going to create a big change in sports. Sports is part of every student's school day, kindergarten through 12th grade, but it was the subject that was most likely to deny girls a place to participate. Many schools offered no PE to girls, or if they required PE, it was something like square dance, a little bit of, modified versions of what we now call basketball. And in a lot of ways, girls experienced a real lack of respect where they were very gifted. You could be a talented athlete at the high school or middle school level, but there would be nowhere for you to go. There weren't any college scholarships for you. Girls were barred from Little League, even if they were the best slugger in town. They could turn to something like the AAU, but then after that, where could they go? So for a lot of people, this was a big moment of rejoicing, that there would be a brand new horizon where schools would have to offer girls an equal shot at sports participation. So immediately there was an uproar. And what we know is that instantly there was a proposal from a Texas senator, John Tower, to exclude football. And his fear was that money would be taken away from football, or that football would be threatened because girls would ask to try out. And this has led to a lot of jokes that there are three sexes, men, women, and football. But what he wanted was an exemption. And that was defeated, but it was a proposal that got people thinking about what it would mean to bring women into participation in sports. Okay. So Title IX actually is given a couple of years to go into effect, up till 1975, so for schools to figure out how are they going to accommodate the interest that many young women had in sports participation. And obviously some schools would have to construct a gym, add a field, hire more coaches, redistribute money. Nobody was certain what that would mean. So right away what we know is just because you have a law doesn't mean that it's really gone into effect. I know because I lived through this period. In the period between 72 and 75, I was a junior high school student wearing this attractive polyester uniform, which looked good on no one and made no one feel like an athlete, was the required uniform at Western Junior High over here in affluent Montgomery County, Maryland. And although I went to school with many senators' kids, in fact, PE with Marcy Rumsfeld, Donald Rumsfeld's daughter, we were never made to feel that we were athletes, nor were we given the same kind of gym training that the guys got. In fact, the most humiliating part of 10th grade for me was having to work out, marching up and down in place to an album with a guy's voice singing, "Go you chicken fat, go." And that's what the girls had to do, a fitness unit, while the guys were actually taking fencing and learning how to stage fight. So my experience was as a little mini feminist. I arrived here in Montgomery County with a copy of Time magazine that had a whole breakdown on Title IX law, and I marched into the principal's office and said, "Hi, I know my rights, okay? I really want to play soccer. I'm a really bad halfback, but I have the right to play." And that's what a lot of this is about. You don't have to be a talented, elite athlete. You have the right to play badly. So I demanded the right to play badly when I was 14. And I thought if I had access, I might get better. There's a thought, right? Okay, so let's say schools all over the country have several years to be in compliance, which represented lost time for somebody like me who might have become a better athlete. It takes quite a while, and then by 75, regulation goes into effect that says, yes, schools have to address the athletic opportunities for girls. Okay, so what's that going to mean? Well, schools are given a set of criteria, but then they're given 3 more years to be in compliance with what the criteria are. And they're basically 3 ways that you can be in compliance with Title IX. You add programs until you show that your school is sort of repairing the lack of activities for girls. In other words, you show you are adding programs, activities in good faith. That's one way. You can show you're accommodating the interests of the students you have. All right, not everyone wants the same sports. Let's say in New England, you have a really dynamite boys ice hockey team, but you have no girls ice hockey team, and they want one. Okay, you have to accommodate them, or you really have to show why not. You might not necessarily have to offer a surfing team at this fictional New England school, but you have to show you're accommodating what the students want and not discriminating by having a team for one and not for the other. The easiest solution, though, and the most popular way that most schools chose to be in compliance is something called proportionality. That's the most controversial prong of the 3. Proportionality says you should give athletic dollars in proportion to the female students you have in the student body. You know, if you have 40% female students, you have to set aside 40% of your athletic budget for women's sports. Okay, so what we know is in 1972, a lot of women were not in college. There were lots of reasons why. Obviously, discrimination is one. This was an easy solution. It's really easy to say, we're probably never going to have more than like 1/3 of the undergrads be female. So, you know, fine, let 1/3 of the athletic budget go to women. Okay, yeah, we'll find it somehow. Nobody ever expected what was going to happen, which is once you say you cannot discriminate in terms of admission, look what's going on now. Women are 55, 57, 60% of undergraduate enrollment today. Does any school give 60% of its athletic budget to women? No, that's never going to happen. All right, so you see our predicament. The compromise in the early 70s was women will never outnumber men in school, so women are never going to need that big of a budget. Football is safe, basketball is safe. We'll find something else for women to do. So this has created a whole lot of tension. Nobody really wants to carve things up in that way. What we found is that at most schools, a lot of the budget might go to football already, okay? Maybe more than half. And what that did was it then squeezed all the remaining money to women and all other men's sports, right? And what that did at a lot of schools, big schools, University of Nebraska, et cetera, it created a gender war between men in all the other athletic programs and all the women at the university. And this is kind of the tension that we've been living with ever since. Much of the revenue-producing sports at any school get the revenue so that they can continue. And how other sports get funding, well, that's up to, an athletic director, et cetera. And although there's a lot of flexibility in how you fund different programs, Title IX created a lot of tension in terms of requiring that a certain amount of dollars actually be set aside for women. No school has the equivalent of a big football team for women. So how you make the budget look like you're putting money into women's sports compared with big men's sports, very difficult to do. And this took most of the late 1970s, a point of great argument at most schools. Okay, so this is the scenario. While all of this is going on, there's obviously a slow creeping improvement in opportunities for women, and gradually a lot of little victories. Some girls are permitted to play Little League, although that's really resented by some fathers. And in some situations where there's a grudging acceptance of girls in Little League or other sports, there's a lot of hostility and backlash. In other places, what makes a big difference in gradually getting the law enforced is fathers of daughters who become really terrific advocates and who obviously can see if the field is substandard, if their daughter's not getting playtime, all of the things that a parent is concerned about. The big problem for most universities was it was very difficult to sort of bring women up to speed with what men enjoyed because facilities had been segregated. So let's remember that at the beginning in '72, women are not in the NCAA. They're in something else, and it's called the AIAW. Okay. Women have separate gyms, and here we are with an object lesson at Georgetown, right? The women's gym is still where the women play basketball. Guys play somewhere else, right? The women's gym at any university was usually very far away from the men's. It often didn't have a lot of the central facilities that the men enjoyed. For instance, a swimming pool, whirlpool bath or a steam room or anything like that. That was usually in the guys' locker room area, and women would be banned from utilizing that because they'd have to walk through the men's locker room. The fact is, even though women's athletic programs were very substandard, and often women had to, have a bake sale to get volleyballs, at least women had control. So you might be surprised to know that there were a lot of female educators who were very anxious about Title IX because they were aware that with integration comes the loss of separate leagues. Okay, we see that when Jackie Robinson comes up to the majors, the old Negro leagues slowly lose their best players and their fans, and that's where you had managers, owners, operators, everyone in charge of their own contract, then that passes into white control. Same thing here. Although many women are excited about the possibility of playing at a better facility, getting more attention, better funding, what happens almost immediately is colleges combine the men's and women's programs into the men's gym. They combine the women's and men's athletic programs and keep a male athletic director, and all the female athletic directors get fired. All the women coaches, bye-bye. So it represented a huge loss of employment, income, power, control, bitterly resented by a lot of women, and I can direct you some really good books about that. Instead, women's sports grudgingly come into the NCAA, and it takes a really long time for that to happen. The NCAA does not want to bring in women, and not until about 1982 does it vote to admit women's sports at the college level. And the compromise there is women are guaranteed 16% representation on the NCAA. Woohoo! When these programs merge, the advantages women gain is now your games are going to be shown on TV. You're going to be in a regular conference. Your rankings, will be presented. Your statistics will be available. You will get exposure, money, recruitment, at least somewhat like what men are enjoying. But female expertise will vanish. And another interesting phenomenon will be a whole lot of men will start coaching women who have never worked with women before. That's both a good and a bad thing. Men will find that they're able to get a decent salary coaching women now, where before no one got paid anything to work with women. But some men who had not worked with women before stumble into new turf like sexual harassment trouble and so on. It's a very interesting merging scenario. Okie dokie. This is sort of the state of things in the beginning of the 80s, and women essentially giving up separation and control for access. And they're brought into the larger picture, and we start to see an improvement in the standards for women's play. We start to see some women's teams demonstrating they can sell out a stadium. Very gradually, we start to see women benefiting from the first few years of college scholarships. We certainly see that in the mid-70s when women go to the Montreal Olympics. But there's a big backlash. So the next thing that happens is there's a backlash from a number of institutions about having to set aside money for women. And the arguments there kind of go like this. Women don't care about sports as much as men, so there's no need for them to have equal money. This is all a social experiment, a feminist plot that's going to turn women into men. It's bad policy. We don't want that here. Another argument would be sports build character in our boys. We don't need that kind of character in our girls. That's a quote from a judge. We don't have the money. It's not fair to make us find it. It's going to have to be taken out of academics, and that's wrong. Women don't want to play. All of these different arguments. And by 1984, there was a big setback, and this is the case Grove City College versus Bell. And that decision said only the actual program in a school that got federal money had to comply with non-discrimination. In other words, if science is getting, some money from the Navy to do naval science, they can't discriminate against women, but sports can. Unless sports is directly getting federal money, athletic program can do whatever it wants. This actually lasted for 4 years. This was signed into law, and it took away the jurisdiction of the education department. It didn't get overturned until 1988, and Congress overrode it at that point. So you can see it was like start and stop and start and stop and kind of start and stop again, and very, very frustrating for a lot of women and girls. And I'll just share with you a couple of little facts, some of my favorites, some of which are right from our area. Before Title IX, state universities in Virginia had turned away something like 25,000 women. During the same period, not a single man was turned away for admission. A brochure from the University of North Carolina declared admission of women, but not men, was restricted only to those who were especially well qualified. University of Michigan, more qualified female students applied than male students, so the school adjusted its requirements to make sure girls were always less than half of the freshman class. They didn't want an overbalance of females. And then here's a few more. High school athletics in Fairfax County, Virginia. The school system spent $9 on boys' teams for every $1 on girls. Parents and coaches had to mow and line the girls' softball fields themselves. Girls' teams were never announced in the morning announcements of the previous night's game scores. In Waco, Texas, the school system spent $250,000 a year to field boys' sports and $900 on girls' sports. And they reported it's just not part of our culture here in Waco, okay? So you can see regionally and locally, everybody had an opinion. All right, so what really starts to change? Well, one of the big things is lawsuits. And we don't really see the first civil suits being brought by students until the early 90s. And that's the point at which we start to see some legal decisions that you can collect some damages if you've really been discriminated against, okay? And that makes a lot of schools sort of wake up. You know, interestingly, a lot of schools will spend more on legal fees to not fund women's sports than the amount of money they're being asked to fund in the first place. But in the 90s, it's when we start to see panicky schools making certain decisions in their budgets that have led to many people angrily calling Title IX a quota law or seeing it as reverse discrimination. How does that emerge? If this is about bringing women up to the level where men play, why is it seen as somehow anti-men and boys? Well, here's the problem. In order to make it look like schools are actually bringing some of their budget into compliance so that more money is going into women's sports, some schools make the choice to eliminate some men's teams to make it look as if equal money goes into men's and women's sports. And in fact, what really happens is money is taken away from existing men's teams. This benefits nobody. It doesn't really help women, and it really hurts guys. Where we see that happening is that in order to find money for women's sports, a lot of schools elected to eliminate what are called non-revenue producing men's sports. So that would be diving, swimming, wrestling, gymnastics. Those are the ones that have taken the biggest hits. Those happen to be Olympic sports. So it created an outcry from our Olympic program. How would the U.S. stay competitive when, in fact, these were the sports that were being targeted? And there's something else going on there, too. It's easy to say football and basketball bring in the most money, bring in the most attention, are revenue-producing sports, and baseball also. They're sacred, don't cut them. Those happen also to be the sports for big-sized guys, okay? So by really pushing out men's swimming, diving, wrestling, gymnastics, that was really eliminating activities for smaller-bodied guys. So it creates a real tension in terms of who's seen as an athletic male body also. And this is a big part of why gender studies looks at what happens to men and women. It created a whole loss of opportunity, in short, for guys who would never make a basketball team or a football team. And resentment against women grew. Simultaneously, one of the things that happened is schools tried another tactic, which was throwing a whole lot of money at women's crew. I have my crew women here? Yeah, okay. So here's what's happening. One way to make it look like a lot of money is going into women's sports is to add crew. Crew's very expensive. A shell is very expensive. Some schools added women's crew, and on paper, it looked like a big budget sport. We really don't have a female equivalent to a football team or, even a basketball team at some schools. And crew looked like a good alternative. And in fact, it didn't necessarily bring in or create opportunities for a lot of young women from the inner city. So now the blame was, this helps women athletes, but primarily white women. Crew was not necessarily supported as a solution everywhere. The most famous story about this in the 70s is what happened at Yale. Yale had a women's crew team, but they weren't allowed to use a boathouse. The men had a really nice boathouse after they worked out in the icy winter, kind of like what we've had this week or whatever. The men could go in and change, get warm, take a hot shower, and then ride comfortably back to campus. The women had to work out on the water, even if it was raining, and then just go sit on a bus in their soaking wet clothes until they went all the way back to campus. And a lot of them ended up with pneumonia. And they wrote grievance after grievance. And then finally, the captain of that team and some of the other women went into the office of the president of the university and took off their shirts, and with naked torsos stood in a row with Title IX painted on their chests. They got a boathouse. Great story, right? Okay. So let's say in some scenarios, you would see schools adding here, trimming there, but everyone had a kind of independent solution. And in fact, a lot of schools were limited in what they could do. So, let's look at a situation like DC. You might have a variety of schools in DC want to expand opportunities for women. They want to comply with the prong, we're not going to take away from men, we're going to add to what women can do. How? Where? You're a landlocked school, and there's already competition for time on the few fields you have. Your green space is limited. How do you expand? Okay, so this has been very challenging for Georgetown. GW's solution, they grabbed Mount Vernon. Okay, so they were instantly able to add women's softball, rugby, lacrosse, field hockey. It looks really great on paper. Okay, adding space, really challenging for a lot of schools. And the alternative has been that a lot of schools have to rent space on other schools' campuses. So this is literally and figuratively a turf war. There's always lots of reasons why it's hard to be in compliance with Title IX. How do you find the space, the money, and so forth? Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples of where the spirit seems to be lacking. There's a lot of things that could be done that cost nothing to improve women's access to sports that have never been done. And I'll give you a few examples. One of the most frustrating aspects is often women find their games just aren't advertised. No posters, no announcements, and there's the example, a PA system in a middle school, but there's also college game day. So a couple of years ago, I noticed that for homecoming weekend, every parent at Georgetown got a letter from the university saying, here are the activities you can do while you're in town for Parents' Weekend. You can do this, or you can go to a men's basketball game. That's great. However, we know women outnumber men at Georgetown. So more than half the parents are coming here to see a daughter. And on that weekend, pretty much all the women's teams had a game. You could add one sentence in that letter that went to all the parents, but it didn't happen. Okay, so that's an example where we just overlook women as athletes. That's discrimination, that's a violation. Okay, you have to promote women's events as well as men's. Another situation would be at a university I taught at once, University X, which I won't name. And what I observed happening there, very snowy state. At one point, the sort of breakdown I had was that almost 8 months of the year, everything was covered with snow. But anyway, when the men's lacrosse team had a game, the field would be plowed. There were bleachers set up for parents, and there was a place for parents to get hot coffee so they could watch the men and cheer. When the women played, they were given shovels to go dig out their field before the game. Nowhere for the parents or fans to sit, no concession, no announcement, no programs. I was shocked, but no one else complained. They didn't know that it was wrong. It was just the way it had been done there for a really long period of time. And that was where I sort of became an advocate. At that school, I was the only person on the faculty who went to the women's basketball games, and I'd sit there alone in a sub-zero gym. And I was cheering on the women's team when one of my faculty colleagues walked by on the way to his car, and he looked at me cheering for my women students and said, "Nothing better to do on a Friday night, huh?" which was a dig both at my social life and at the students who were winning a game at the time. But anyway, okay. Just a little bit more, and then I'll open up for discussion. Okay, so the long list of grievances against both women athletes and women in education are easily researched, listed, and we can complain and complain. The fact is, one of the big interesting changes is having made opportunities for women available, women have done spectacularly. So the argument women don't want to play sports, be lawyers, go to med school, that's been disproven. Women have been fantastically successful in school, and we've seen women bring home the gold, win the World Cup victory. There's just any number of great examples. The big problem remains that we're in an economic crisis, and most schools are looking for ways to save money. And quite a few have decided to just sort of stick with one or two big budget sports, and have tried to be in Title IX compliance by, again, really letting a lot of men's teams go. The problem for universities, if I want to be sympathetic to the schools for a second, is there's something I haven't mentioned. School spirit. More people go to men's games than women's, and we have not been able to change that. We can't force people to go to the women's events. Most schools will say it's important to keep the money in men's sports because when the men's football or basketball teams do well, people donate to a school. The school's name stays in the press. Alumni come back and donate and make scholarships. More people apply. You get more applications for admission in a year when a men's team has a good year. If a women's team has a good year, it doesn't have the same effect. It doesn't attract the same money. It doesn't attract the same fans. This is very frustrating for all of you athletes, right? But it's an example that there's something we can't really quantify, and that is that we just haven't had a tradition until really recently of people supporting women's sports. Schools are aware of that, and they really want to attract donor dollars. So they're very reluctant to take money away from promoting men's games or having them in a really large venue. So, you know, the problem just sort of continues, and that's something we're not sure how to fix. I'd like to add something to that, because what I've observed, having been a fan for, all these years, through all of this success of Title IX, and if we imagine Title IX as a feminist issue, I don't see any other women's studies faculty at the women's games. How come I'm there cheering on? This is important. This is a victory. This is a symbol. This is a political issue. How come women's sports hasn't been embraced as an issue by other women's studies faculty? I'm calling them out. Show up, okay? Because I think that that's an example where we see rhetoric, but we don't see behinds in the seats. And, because so many women's games are free, there's no reason for that to continue, right? All right. And y'all have heard my story about confronting President Clinton on this, right? Okay, I'll repeat the story here. A final example, and I'll open it up for discussion. What does it mean when you don't have people really supporting what the law is all about in ways where it's possible? So when I first moved to DC, I went to a women's basketball game at GW, and I was shocked to have to go through a metal detector. And this was way before security concerns in the US. So I had no idea why we were being stopped and frisked. And somebody said, the president is here and he has brought Chelsea to a game. So Bill Clinton and Chelsea Clinton were sitting in a little box at the Smith Center at GW. And at that time, the way tickets were sold was you had a sort of double header. You had a men's game followed by a women's game. You paid $9 for the whole day. You had a nice day. So this was very exciting. Here's the president. He's waving. He's shaking hands. It was very accessible. And the men played. The men won. The president got up to leave. And I sort of sat there simmering like chicken soup, thinking, wait a minute. You're not going to walk out when the women take the court. You're the commander-in-chief. So I kind of pushed my way through the crowd and moved up to the president and stuck out my hand and said, hi, President Clinton. I'm a women's studies professor here, and I want to encourage you to watch the women's game. Don't walk out the door now that the men have won and the women are going to play. I think it would be meaningful for your daughter here and all of our female athletes in the District of Columbia if you would cheer on the women's game. They're actually better ranked than the men this year, and you're the head enforcer of Title IX law, which I think has been at that point. And, I went on, and he shook my hand and said, well, I would love to stay, but I have an appointment at the White House at 2. And, I looked at my watch and said, okay, you can watch the first 20 minutes of the women's game. Go sit down. So he went and sat back down. So I gave a direct order to the President of the United States. And then he became the first U.S. president to phone his congratulations to the women's NCAA champion team that year. So I like to think I had a little something to do with that. Believe me, I could never do it again. When I think about that now, and of course now there would be much more Secret Service and so forth, but it just seems so obvious. Even if you do have to leave, and we know you do, cheer for the women for 5 minutes. Don't show with your back turned that this doesn't count. It really does count, So I changed his mind. So I'm happy about that. All right. There's going to be much, much more, and the readings will guide you. But let me pause and take questions and comments, because there's a great deal to think about here. Who has a story about, in their high school, middle school, obvious unfairness, something with uniforms or fields, even recently in the, 21st century? Yeah.
In middle school, the men's basketball program offered early morning practice, and I was on the women's basketball team. I also did softball and volleyball and whatever, but, I just wanted to come shoot around with better competition, and so the coach was like, of course, come. And so I go and I work out, and at the end when it comes to be, 5-on-5 games, they were gonna play shirts versus skins, and one of the guys looks at me and goes, so who are you gonna play for? And I was just like, you're joking, right? Like, I've just done the whole hour-and-a-half workout at 6:30 in the morning, like, and the coach looked at me, he's like, you can hit him if you want.
Okay. I mean, this is just, it's very, very hard to be taken seriously. Where was that? What state?
Phoenix, Arizona.
Oh, in Arizona. Okay. All right. Not to pick on any one state. It's just I like to be reminded. Who else? Anyone else have a good story? Yeah.
When I was younger, I moved from a private school to a public school at the age of 6 or so, 7. And I grew up a Yankee fan, like New Yorker, like huge Yankee fan. And in the town that I moved to, all the girls played softball. And that was so foreign to me, such a foreign concept. And I said to my parents, I want to play baseball. And it just so happened that there was a baseball league in town, but there weren't really any girls in it. So my parents did what they had to do. I being a 7-year-old kid, I didn't really have much, say in it. But my parents contacted the head of the league, and they said, yeah, sure, there's no baseball league for girls, so you can play. And I played, and I did really well, and I was the first girl to make the All-Star team. So,
great.
Yeah, but it's just crazy to think that even in our lifetime, there's still those issues.
Well, but you're raising an important point. The law says that if you don't have a girls' team, and you do have a boys' team, and the girl is qualified, she has to be able to try out for that team. And that has been resisted in a lot of places. What we haven't talked about is that what if you're a guy and you want to do a female event? And one of the things that you're seeing is we've changed a lot in terms of what we expect from men and the popularity of a show like Glee is one example. But let's say a very popular case is a guy who wants to play field hockey. And does the school have to give a guy opportunity to play on the girls' team. And usually there you'll find parents objecting, what if the girls get hurt? You'll find the opponent team might forfeit rather than play against a school that has a guy on the team. And then the other version of that is where you have a woman who wants to do something like wrestling, where there isn't a girls' wrestling team. Does she get to get a spot on the guys' team? That's kind of a no-win situation for a lot of people, because if a boy defeats a girl, he looks, unchivalrous, and if she defeats him, that's not good. So a lot of it is from the parents' viewpoint about the delicate, psychology of kids going through puberty, and how do we address that? How do we nuance that? When you're 7, it's not as much of an issue. But I think something that all of you have looked at, and especially those of you who took my intro class and so on, what we're finding in the US is the years when boys and girls are really similar, and there's not that much difference between your bodies. In fact, the girls are bigger than the guys. That's all changing. Girls are going through puberty much earlier, and you're shaving years off that tomboy time. It's very frustrating. In other words, it used to be a girl who was a real slugger, or who was, playing on a boys' team and didn't look much different than a guy and had a boy's haircut and all of that. That lasted till you were 11 or 12, and no one cared. In fact, they thought it was kind of cute. Okay, now you're starting puberty at age 9. Now in 4th grade, you have parents and peers who don't want to go up against a girl. You don't want to play against a girl who has, signs of budding breasts or whatever it might be. So we've lost quite a couple of years there of saying there's no reason to deny a girl a space on a boys' team. We'll have a whole discussion on transgender at another time, too. I don't mean to sound so 20th century, but there you go. What are some other things you can see as sort of obvious problems with trying to be fair, or reluctance to be fair, or attitudes we still have that are, school is one thing, but sports are different? Yeah.
Well, I actually just had a question.
Sure.
In Title IX, the section on athletics that requires both genders to be able to try out for a team if there aren't, was that there from the beginning, or did that come in later? No,
that evolves. And those are the cases that you're going to read about in Female Gladiators. This goes through all of the big cases. Do you have to let a girl box? Do you have to let a girl, be a place kicker? Some schools have made that a compromise. Most of the cases that are most complicated are about contact sports. And because that's where there's so much tension, you can see why something like soccer has been turned into almost a women's sport in the US. That emerged in popularity for youth right around the same time Title IX was, coming into law. And it was almost a sort of perfect solution. There wasn't a lot of contact, but it was a game of skill. And it was something that a lot of schools added for women, but ironically not for men. All right, now it's the reverse. Everywhere else in the world, soccer is very masculine, very much about male pride, certainly in Brazil, England, Italy, all of South America, et cetera. So the fact that it's become identified with sort of white suburban girls in the US, that's a real anomaly. But it was a solution because it was something that could be not too expensively funded, and it didn't have the risks that other contact sports had. Where that seems very unfair to men, here's an example. The state of Arizona, okay? So in Arizona, you have the 3 main in-state schools, University of Arizona, Northern Arizona, and Arizona State. They all have a women's soccer team, but they don't have a guys' team. That means if you're a gifted guy, you have to go out of state to play on the state soccer team, all right? So in a lot of ways, there's lopsidedness. Okay, so the question is about contact sports. Yeah, that's hashed out later. The big problem is you're directed to create a women's team that's a parallel to the men's, but usually you can't get enough women to have a whole women's wrestling team or what have you, or a women's football team, and then you wouldn't have enough women on other schools to be your opponent. All of this, is part of the sort of piecemeal effect. And we see that everywhere in American law. It's the same with gay rights law. Each state has a different approach or a different timeline, and it's exhausting. Yeah.
It's not necessarily a story, but I thought it was intriguing at least. In Jersey, for instance, there's a girls volleyball team, but there's no boys volleyball team. But then you go out in the West Coast, and it's really popular. And I met a kid when I transferred to a prep school who played boys volleyball elsewhere, and he was like, I really excelled in it, and he really did well. However, when he came to the prep school, it wasn't available, and he wanted to pursue a scholarship elsewhere when he was younger, I guess. But that kind of fell down. And it was, when you're talking about the regional differences and whatnot, I thought it was intriguing that different areas it varies in that format, especially with volleyball, because it is an Olympic sport and everything.
Yeah, and beach volleyball, which began as very, very male and very macho in California, and then became more available as a West Coast sport for men and women. In a lot of places on the East Coast, volleyball is seen as feminine. And you're right, you wouldn't be able to get recruited if there's no program for you. So the problem is accommodating everybody's interests. Elsewhere, students I've had over the years have told me their school offers a variety of sports, but there's a stereotype that you should play this one or that one if you're male or female. I had a wonderful group in another year where there were a bunch of guys on the men's basketball team and a bunch of guys on the soccer team. And the basketball guys said that where they came from in Georgia, a guy who played soccer was known as a grass fairy. So in these situations, I have to jump up in class and go, yellow card. Okay, everybody just calm down. Everybody's cool. But the idea that in a lot of places there's just really one sport that gets the support. Again, how do you quantify morale? Volleyball, in some places, swimming, certainly. In other places, there'll be a women's crew team and not a men's crew team. So, it's really complicated. And we have a very litigious society. So what a lot of schools are afraid of is someone is going to bring a lawsuit. They'll look for a compromise, but, it's daunting. Somebody else had their hand up. Yeah.
I had a different technical question about the thing here, but just to speak to this a little bit, I played volleyball here. My little sister is on a volleyball scholarship at Arizona State. Arizona State doesn't have a men's volleyball program. They have a club team, and that club team's historically been great, and I've played for coaches that played for that team. But volleyball is very big in the Southwest. When I was growing up, it was the largest expanding sport in my state, and probably on the coast too. California is known for its volleyball programs. They're very, very competitive. And even Texas, well, we just say it's because they're taller than everybody else. They have really great programs as well. But as far as getting recruited for volleyball, we don't go to the East Coast to play in tournaments. You stay in Los Angeles or in Denver, in Texas. Those are the big recruiting tournaments. Las Vegas even, that's a big one. So
it's very frustrating. Now, I come, of course, from a volleyball family, and my father tried to single-handedly change this trend. He built the volleyball courts that are over the Lincoln Memorial and got permission from the Park Service to develop a free volleyball space to try and get competitive volleyball part of DC life. And he ran DC doubles tournaments for many, many years. So a lot of people did get some volleyball training here in the East Coast. So we're very proud of that. But yeah, it's not consistent. On top of all of this, we have another trend, which I've talked about a lot in this class. We don't really have a state system, as you saw in the former East Germany or the former Soviet Union and so forth, that identifies and recruits talented youth and puts them in, let's say, a government training academy to funnel into the Olympics. And college is kind of it. And therefore, this is one of the few kind of government programs that does pay attention to who is talented and so forth. And it matters to a lot of people if you have the opportunity now to be seen by a recruiter. So an area that's targeted for monitoring is where a school has more teams than it can accommodate on one field, who gets to play on that field in which season. And a lot of women have complained. I think there was a case in Michigan that the girls' soccer team was only allowed to use the field in spring, but the recruiters for colleges were all coming in fall. So one of the things that's a big headache for compliance officers is they have to look at, are men and women getting the same accommodation in terms of, you know, when are you playing? Are you available for recruitment? Are your events publicized? Are you getting new uniforms? Are your games televised? All of that. So you really have to be kind of a magician. Schools all are assigned a compliance officer. You do reviews every couple of years, and you can talk to the ones here. These are folks who have to pacify coaches who are outraged that they're being asked to give up this or they don't get that. And then again, a lot of this is about pitting different teams against one another. Since we're just coming off of an Olympic year, everyone's very sensitive to how having the opportunity to compete in college is, for a lot of people, their way to get Olympic training. We don't really make all those necessary funds available to every kid. So now a lot of parents are aware there's a law that's on my side, and we're seeing recruitment of girls starting earlier and earlier. And this brings me to the last point of the day. There are a lot of folks who are worried that all of this is nice, but it's turning women into guys, meaning it's commercially exploiting women. It is looking for who is the girl who can make a school money, trying to get young women identified really early and pushing them to be a big success so that they can attract sponsors and dollars. It's putting a lot of pressure on girls to play and not so much focus on schools and so on. A lot of parents have argued that they would certainly like their daughters to make the same money that guys do in playing sports. But the fact is, there are very few professional opportunities for women after college. There really aren't. What that means is it matters very much to women athletes to get playtime in college. That's your professional moment. It's not going to come later. So fewer women are willing to be walk-ons than guys. And this is what has led to some challenges to Title IX recently. So the last sort of big tinkering with Title IX was the addition of a fourth prong, which was schools didn't have to be in compliance this way, this way, this way. They could send a survey around. They could send a survey around asking women, are your needs being met? Do you want to play sports? Let us know. A couple of problems with the survey prong. Almost everyone thought it was spam and deleted it from their email box. It got a very low rate of response, and it was only sent to women. So the logic twist there is the assumption was, by nature, women don't care about sports. They care about drama or choir. So, we have to ask, do you really care about sports? Okay, good. We didn't think so. And in contrast, the assumption was guys, it did matter to them more. It hurt more if they couldn't play. So that was an effort to kind of confirm a social bias, and that was overturned fairly recently. But that was a very intense challenge to Title IX. Prove that women care, and women kind of had to say, but we do, but we do, but we do. All right? And this is just, sort of one example. where obviously when women have the facilities and opportunities, they perform splendidly. But it's a point of social anxiety in society. Will women be tempted by the same things that have haunted some high-profile male athletes? Gambling, drugs, getting into trouble? Sure. But that's only a small percentage of athletes altogether. Women tend to do pretty well in terms of grades and playing sports and so forth. They're a very good investment for a school. The big issue is we want women to play like men and look like women. I'm going to stop there. We're all familiar with that story. We'll continue with that for the rest of the semester. Thank you very much.
All new episodes of Lectures in History will be back next week. Remember, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please tell your friends, share it with a neighbor, or post it on social media. Also follow so you never miss an episode.